South Korea should build nuclear weapons. Filipino national settlements. This South Korea should build nuclear weapons.
Okay, welcome everyone to the grand final of the National Schools Debating Championships 2008. Okay, so before we actually go into the debate, there are about 1/3 of the people here are here for the first time and have no background in debate. So I would like to make a brief explanation of how our two contestant teams have made it up in Korean. 일단 토론 대회를 개최하면서 4번의 예선전을 거쳐서 거기에서 가장 높은 점수를 받은 그러한 팀들이 8강으로 올라왔습니다. 그래서 8강, 그리고 오늘 4강, 그리고 이제 결승전에 나온 팀인데요. Proposition side, we have 대원 Foreign Language High School, 대원 외고에서 올라온 팀이고, Opposition side, Seoul International School, 서울국제고에서 팀이 나왔습니다. 네, 조금 후에 디베이트를 체어하는 우리 Chief Adjudicator 선생님으로부터 각 학생의 이름과 다시 한번 인트로덕션이 있을 것이고요. 디베이트는 3대3으로 보실 수 있다시피 진행이 됩니다. 그래서 각 스피커가 찬성팀에서 첫 번째 스피커가 나와서 8분, 반대팀에서 8분, 찬성팀에서 8분, 반대팀에서 8분, 찬성팀에서 8분, 반대팀에서 8분씩 나와서 하고요. 마지막에 반대팀에서 4분짜리 마무리 스피치가 있고 찬성팀에서 4분짜리 마무리 스피치가 있습니다. 각 마무리 스피치를 제외한 모든 스피치에서는 상대편에서 포인트 오브 인포메이션이라는 이의를 제기할 수 있는 기회가 있는데 처음 1분 그리고 마지막 1분을 제외한 시간에서 그렇게 할 수 있습니다. 그래서 1분이 지나면 여기 우리 타임키퍼가 종을 한번 땡 울릴 거예요. Can you ring the bell for us once? 땡. 네, 1분이 지나면 저런 소리가 날 것이고요. 7분이 지난 다음에 다시 한번 땡. 그리고 8분이 지나면 2번. 네, 저런 소리가 나면 이제 스피치를 마칠 시간이 되었다라는 뜻일 것입니다. 그래서 디베이트를 마친 다음에 앞에 앉아 계신 우리 심사위원들이 각각 따로따로 결정을 내려서 누가 이겼는지에 대한 투표를 하고 그것에 대해서 다수권으로 결정이 나게 될 것입니다. 디베이트 재밌게 잘 보시고요. 이제 우리 디베이트의 체어인 그리고 이번 대회 심사위원장이신 황윤성 선생님께 마이크를 넘기겠습니다. She'll give you the introduction.
Okay, I'd like to welcome everybody to the final debate. Thank you for showing your support. And I'd also like to congratulate both teams who have made it to the finals. Congratulations. On the government side, we have, as Joshua mentioned, Daewon, and on the opposition, SIS. And the motion that will be debated upon today is, this House believes that South Korea should build nuclear weapons. So, with that, we will begin the debate with the Prime Minister, Kim Kyung-don.
Ladies and gentlemen, Our weapons are meant to deter, not to destroy. Let me discuss the context in which this debate occurs today. Ladies and gentlemen, South Korea has been experiencing a deteriorating relationship with the government of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. And there is a dire need for the South Korean government to create a mechanism of self-defense. And therefore, the proposition side would have you believe that there is a need for self-defense and that we would create nuclear weapons for purposes of deterrence and not destruction. Weapons, ladies and gentlemen, are not all essentially bad. It is rather with the intent with which they are utilized that they become weapons of mass destruction. With the case line provided to you by the proposition side of today's debate, it will become clear to you that our intents are good, and therefore, the nuclearization of South Korea will do nothing but good in the long run. But before we move on to our substantive case, let me define certain key terms. No, thank you, ma'am. Let me define for you certain key terms that will help us focus the scope of this debate. First of all, we would like to define South Korea as the South Korean government, and the word build we will delineate to you throughout our policy, and nuclear weapons as atomic warheads. As the first speaker of the proposition side, I will be delineating for you the policy line, the need for self-defense, and the necessary of a balance of power on the Korean peninsula. Our second speaker, Do-hyung, will talk to you about how this plan is actually practical and can be carried out in the status quo. So without further ado, let's move on to our policy line. We would follow the Indian model, ladies and gentlemen, which is that we would construct nuclear weapons under the supervision and assistance from the IAEA. No, thank you, ma'am. And this is actually a model which has been successful in the past, and we haven't seen any exacerbation of violence in the Pakistani-Indian region, and a usage of nuclear weapons, and therefore we believe that this is a good precedence with which we can refer to. So let's move on to our first argument, which is that the need for self-defense is rising in South Korea. Let's look at the disparity of power on the Korean peninsula on one level. DPRK has 1 million troops, the fifth largest army in the entire world, whereas the Republic of Korea has only 600,000 troops. North Korea uses 18%, no thank you ma'am, 18% of its GNP, while South Korea utilizes only 2.9%. And according to Bruce Cummings, a lead analyst on North Korea, he says that 90% of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea's military can march into Seoul with a time frame of just 4 hours. And with conventional artillery weapons, the North Korean government can obliterate Seoul in 4 minutes' time. North Korea, ladies and gentlemen, it should not be overlooked, already owns 9 nuclear warheads. And the Republic of Korea has nothing but 600,000 infantry troops, which must be used to keep these armies back for a mere time span of 10 minutes. This was analyzed by the chief North Korean analyst, Bruce Cummings, in his book, North Korea, ladies and gentlemen. There is nothing that the South Korean government now has to deter North Korea with the exception of the U.S. troops here. And our dependence on U.S. troops does not mean that we have any measure of self-defense at all. No, thank you, ma'am. The context under which self-defense is necessary, ladies and gentlemen, is the recent deteriorating relations with the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. First of all, the North Korean government has stopped all funding to the Gaesong Industrial Complex, which was a measure of peacekeeping between the two nations. Second of all, there was a murder of a tourist in the Kumgang Mountain Reserve, and this has also exacerbated relations between the two nations. Yes, ma'am.
Doesn't this deterioration within the relations between the two countries just prove that South Korea cannot afford to provoke North Korea with the building of nuclear weapons?
However, ma'am, the end result of a nuclear weapon being in South Korea means that they will level the playing field and the diplomatic negotiation field between the two parts of the peninsula, and therefore open rooms for negotiations on a deeper and on a larger level for both parties. And therefore, ladies and gentlemen, we believe that it will actually bring peace and an opportunity for deeper talks in the future. Now let's move on to continue to delineate how South Korea and North Korean governments have deteriorated in the recent times. The Premier Kim Jong-il has stated that he would turn the Republic of Korea into a sea of fire. The phone lines, which have been in Panmunjom for nearly 50 years, have been recently cut off, and this is something that has not happened even in the very controversial Shilmido case. So these indicators clearly point out to us, ladies and gentlemen, that there is a dire need for self-defense on the southern part of the Korean peninsula. And there's also the point, ladies and gentlemen, that we cannot really rely on the United States government as of the status quo, because with the inauguration of the Obama administration, which proposes a no-violence policy against Democratic People's Republic of Korea, the United States government, like all governments, ladies and gentlemen, looks out for its own interests first. And a day might come when the Republic of Korea might fall under the PRK on its list of priorities. While it is highly likely that in the current status, the United States of America will come to the aid of the Republic of Korea. However, it is a duty of a responsible government to prepare for all eventualities, and therefore a mechanism of self-defense is necessary in this current state where we cannot rely fully on the United States of America to provide its aid for us. Let's look at our second argument, which is that there is a necessity for a balance of power on the Korean peninsula. Well, before we do that, let's actually look at the point that of all the nuclear powers available, such as the United Kingdoms, India, Pakistan, Israel, the United States was the only nation which used nuclear weapons in anger. So it is also because it causes such great detriments and it causes repercussions that cannot be contained on a small-scale level. Therefore, the Republic of Korea will also use it in a responsible manner and in a way that ensures peace rather than causes detriments to that point. Now, thank you, sir. Countries enter into international relations, ladies and gentlemen, under the understanding that to commit an act of aggression is to ensure mutual destruction. The construction of nuclear warheads in South Korea, ladies and gentlemen, will help ensure this policy and ensure this understanding is circulated between North Korea and South Korea. As of the status quo, because the United States of America is the only power with enough strength to hold back North Korea in the status quo, and South Korea is powerless, in fact, without the aid of the United States of America, it needs a self-defense mechanism, and we believe that nuclear weapons, which will not be used in anger, as history shows, and will act as a shared detriment which can ensure the balance of power on the Korean peninsula, should be constructed in all cases. Ladies and gentlemen, we do not encourage the proliferation of all nuclear weapons all around the world. That would be committing political suicide. However, ladies and gentlemen, we must agree to the fact that under stringent IAEA regulations and with the construction of nuclear weapons which can benefit the self-defense capacity of the South Korean government and ensure the balance of power between the two parts of the peninsula, you must believe that there is a potential merit to be had in building nuclear weapons in South Korea, ladies and gentlemen. Our nuclear weapons will not be there for the destruction of humankind, but rather for the deterrence of an act of aggression that will lead to such. Thank you.
I thank the Prime Minister for his speech. I would now like to call upon the Leader of Opposition, Stephanie Carr. Before you begin, Stephanie, could you check if the microphone?
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. All countries state that their weapons are not for waging war. They state that their weapons are purely for self-defense, just for deterrence. That is what all countries say when they build their own armies. When they build their own armies and add to the arms race that as we see around this world and the opposition and are very alarmed by it, they say that they're doing it in interest of self-defense. And that is exactly what the proposition has come up here to say. But we on Team Opposition do not believe it is so. We believe that although South Korea may have good intentions, the effects and ramifications of its policy of building nuclear weapons is going to be so detrimental, not only to South Korea, but also to North Korea and the rest of the international community, that we cannot stand to propose this motion. Now, before I move on to explain to you our team split, I'll be going over the policy that the proposition gave us, then go over the two main points that our Prime Minister gave, and go explain why they're completely false and actually undermine the efforts that they're trying to attain, and then explain to you that, and then go over our own two constructive points. Now, first of all, our team split goes as follows. Our first point is on how such a policy would exacerbate the political and military situation with North Korea. Our second point is that it would be very detrimental to South Korea's position in the international community, both politically and security-wise. It would also have ramifications on the international community. And our third point, which my deputy leader of the opposition will present, is that there will be great economic costs, which we cannot afford at this time. Now, first of all, on their policy. They stated that the IAEA would be regulating all such nuclear activity. However, we see that the IAEA is not fail-proof, and that people around the international community have lost a great deal of trust within the IAEA because of its failed attempts within the Middle East and with North Korea. They stated the example of India. However, we think the example of India is actually great for the opposition because we see that when India and Pakistan both have nuclear weapons, those two countries are not on friendly terms, and South and North Korea will similarly not be on friendly terms. No, thank you, sir. Now, I'd like to move on to the points by the proposition. First of all, they talked about a disparity between North and South Korea. But in response to this, I have two questions. First, why hasn't North Korea already attacked South Korea? Second, why does North Korea try and put so much effort into building a huge military? Now, first of all, North Korea hasn't attacked South Korea already because it fears retribution. Not only are there U.S. troops in South Korea, they also fear international retribution. Not even North Korea's closest allies, such as China, could justify an invasion of South Korea, whether nuclear or whether infantry. Such an invasion would clearly be an attack of war and justifiable under United Nations conventions. And as Security Council powers, all the countries and the United Nations would therefore not be able to justify such an action. Next, why does North Korea build such a huge military power in the first place? Now we see that North Korea is lagging behind South Korea economically by a very great deal, and politically in the realm of the international diplomacy. We see that they're having a military, they're building up such a huge military because they think that's what levels the playing field for them. We have to understand that we're not, North Korea, we always have to think about what North Korea's perception of the international community and of what South Korea is. South Korea can defend its policy all it wants to be defense, but if North Korea thinks it's aggression, then it is aggression to them and they will act to it and respond to it as such. We have to see that if South Korea tries to level the playing field on a military level as well, then North Korea is going to feel even more isolated, even weaker, and is going to try and retaliate to show how great and how strong its military power is. Now on their second point, they say there's a need for balance of power. We also agree there's a need for balance of power. So we think it's ironic that the proposition is advocating that we're going to try and add more weapons when we should be actually trying to demilitarize the Korean Peninsula. In fact, going through with this policy would not only make North Korea mad, it would also ensure mutually assured destruction, which is one of the main policies behind nuclear weapons. No, thank you, sir. Now, I'd like to go on to the stance and to the main points of this opposition today. The proposition must prove to us that there's a need, a concrete benefit in enacting this policy, and that it is in international interests. These are the three criteria that we have brought up today. We as the opposition, through our case line and through the other rebuttals, will prove to you exactly the opposite. Now, on our first point, and how it would exacerbate the political and security situation with North Korea. Now, let's think about South Korea. It has very unique relations with North Korea. They used to be one country together, and after they split, they waged war against one another, and there are very many difficult times and tensions, as the Prime Minister already pointed out. We see that this is exactly why we cannot afford to provoke them. We have seen that North Korea has proven by its withdrawal and signing and not signing and violating and upholding the non-NPT that it has shown it is irresponsible, unpredictable, and very sensitive to matters of international security. So South Korea suddenly upsets the balance and suddenly changes the whole status quo. This North Korean government is not going to be very happy because North Korea is in the hands of a dictator and an armed elite, which is not going to be very happy with the proposal by the proposition. I'd like to also point out, oh yes sir.
It's exactly because they're exacerbating relations with North Korea that we want to build nuclear weapons to deter violence.
To worsen the situation even more, sir? To worsen the situation even more, sir, we don't believe as the opposition that actually enacting this policy is going to make the situation better. It's going to make it worse. They on the proposition have to prove to us that this situation, that this exacerbation of tensions is going to get even better if they enact their policy. Now, let's move on. No, thank you, sir. Now, let's move on. If South Korea actually enacts this policy, it's going to look so hypocritical. We have been telling North Korea all along, don't build nuclear weapons, don't build nuclear weapons, and now South Korea comes on and says they're going to build nuclear weapons. Where does that put South Korea in terms of trust with North Korea? North Korea is not going to look at South Korea with the same trust anymore. It's going to be suspicious of of this country, no thank you sir, and it's going to ask why the international community is discriminating against North Korea then. Why is the international community saying some countries can have nuclear weapons but others can't? We see that this is going to even isolate North Korea even more from the international community. Lastly, under this first point, we see that it's going to create a sort of a Cold War, an arms race. We all know what the Cold War entailed. It entailed a huge arms race between the United States and the Soviet Union. We believe that similar effects are happening today between India and Pakistan. They gave us the example, but these two countries just show why South and North Korea cannot afford to become two neighbors on a very violent and bloody border. They say that India and Pakistan they're getting better nowadays, but that's not true. Just take the issue of separatist Kashmir. They're fighting over this issue of Kashmir and saying that territory is theirs.
Point of information.
No, thank you, sir. No, thank you, sir. Now I'd like to move on to our second point. Our second point is on South Korea in the realm of the international community, and this can be divided into two subpoints. A, Korea's image, and B, the dangerous international precedent such a policy would have for an entire international community. Korea is a signatory of the NPT, ladies and gentlemen. The non-signatories are Israel, India, and Pakistan. By violating a major international agreement, it would make countries worry about South Korea's motive and trustworthiness, just as it does about North Korea and the status quo. South Korea runs the risk of being seen as a rogue state, such as Iran, Libya, and North Korea, and could receive political and diplomatic condemnation. That's a very sad thing for the country that produced Pan Ki-moon. Next, let's go on to the dangerous international precedent. Basically, by making this policy, South Korea is making a statement that the correct response to an arms race is to continue that arms race. We on the opposition cannot condone this. We believe that it's going to escalate proliferation of WMDs worldwide, despite what the proposition does not want. We see that in other cases, Colombia and Ecuador, Dominican Republic and Haiti, in these countries where countries are fighting, they might see that the increase in military arms and the increase in atomic warheads is a solution to their problems as well. And this is something that's going to fuel arms races around the world, which we as the opposition, again, cannot condone. What have I shown you today as the first leader of the opposition? We think that war should not ever be supported in any way by building nuclear warheads, as the proposition claims. They claim it is to deter. Ladies and gentlemen, it will do nothing but to increase, escalate, and exacerbate. Thank you.
I thank the Leader of Opposition for his speech. I would now like to call upon the Deputy Prime Minister, 권도형이.
Ladies and gentlemen, before we proceed anywhere further in this debate, there's a critical question that remains to be answered. And that question is, whether weapons and nuclear weapons are harmful in and of themselves, or whether the method by which men use them are bad. Ladies and gentlemen, what we want to do on side government in this debate is to construct nuclear weapons for the purposes of creating a balance of power that's going to deter violence, ladies and gentlemen. We do not seek active violence, which is a major assumption on side opposition in this debate. Now let's look at what some of the things that they did wrong. First of all, a lot of wills on side opposition. Their entire case was basically based upon possibilities. What deteriorating relations could possibly happen if South Korea were to construct nuclear weapons, ladies and gentlemen. Whereas where we on side government told you real life examples and precedents under which South Korea will benefit if we were to construct nuclear weapons for the purposes of deterrence. Now to reconstruct the team proposition's case. No thank you, ma'am. Our policy was that of the IAEA. And the first speaker from side proposition came up here and told us that IAEA has lost her trust in the Middle East and Africa. Ladies and gentlemen, she hasn't really given you a solid example by which IAEA has actually lost its trust. In fact, what we do say is that the IAEA is the most legitimate organization that gains international trust, ladies and gentlemen. The fact is that we have their support. It is legitimate for the South Korean government to take the active action of building nuclear weapons. No thank you, no thank you, sir. Our first speaker came up here and talked to you about how we need weapons for self-defense. Now there are 2 points of refutation to this one argument. Firstly, the first speaker came up here and asked the question of why hasn't the North Korean government has already attacked the South Korean government. We have 2 points of refutation to this response. Firstly, we say that we have no means of retribution, unlike what team opposition says. And what we want to say is to create the perception of retribution, to make sure that by a principle principle of self-preservation, no thank you ma'am, by principle of self-preservation that the North Korean government will adhere to rationale and actually engage in talks with South Korea. Secondly, we say that current unraveling relations with the North Korean government and the South Korean government indicates the possibility of violence actually occurring. Our first speaker came up here and talked to you about how the telephone lines have been severed. He also talked about the increasing military exacerbated situation along the South Korean border. Now, the second refutation that they had to our first argument, no thank you ma'am, was that about why do they build big armies? Our response to this, ladies and gentlemen, is that it does not matter why they build big armies, ladies and gentlemen. It is the possibility that they may be utilized against our citizens that causes worry to side proposition in a minute, ma'am. What we say is that if there's a possibility of our citizens dying, then it is the duty of a responsible government to take necessary actions to cause deterrence. Is that not so?
That is actually not so. And would you not agree that inversely, if we allow for South Korea to build nuclear weapons, that North Korea will see this as a possible threat?
How will North Korea see this as a possible threat, ladies and gentlemen? According to North Korean logic, nuclear weapons are built for self-defense, ladies and gentlemen. And in situations by which the South Korean government has not taken any active steps to exacerbate the North Korean foreign policy, in fact, we're one of the biggest contributors of aid to North Korean famine. Under those circumstances, ladies and gentlemen, we do not believe that, we challenge team opposition to prove that relations would actually be exacerbated and North Korea will act out violently. Now, our second argument was that about balance of power. And their response to this was that we want to demilitarize Korea. Our response to this, ladies and gentlemen, is based on pragmatics. What we say, ladies and gentlemen, is that it's basically impossible to demilitarize Korea. What we say is that we want to create a system by which a balance of power is going to be created. If we had the ability to demilitarize, no thank you ma'am, demilitarize North Korea, we would have done it a long time ago. But at the absence of such an ideal and real utopia solution, we say that our solution side proposition is the right one. And they brought up some substantive arguments of their own, ladies and gentlemen. The first argument was that about exacerbating relationships with North Korea. We have 2 points of refutation to this first argument. First of all, we say the side opposition never showed how this is going to exacerbate relations with North Korea, ladies and gentlemen. Secondly, we say that North Korea is necessarily geared for self-preservation. Ever since Kim Jong-il took power, he has taken the active steps to make sure that his governments could not be undermined. Under circumstances under which, no thank you, Ma'am, under circumstances under which the North Korean government wants to preserve itself, in order to preserve itself, ladies and gentlemen, using nuclear weapons and using violence against a nuclear power will necessarily mean self-destruction. We say that North Korea would adhere to rationale of not using violence under this circumstance. Their second argument, ladies and gentlemen, was that it would damage the perception of South Korean relations. And this moves me onto my substantive argument, that our solution is going to be practical under the team line that our weapons are meant to deter, not to destroy. We have 3 levels of analysis. Firstly, we say that South Korea is rather responsible. We say that South Korea has never taken active violence to assail another country. They question our motives. They come up here and tell us that South Korea is necessarily going to use our weapons for the purposes of exacerbating violence. No thank you, ma'am. What we say is that South Korea has never had a precedent under which we have taken active steps to attack another country. Also, acts in tandem with the international organizations such as the International Atomic Energy Agency and the United Nations will be condoned by the international community. If we were to examine the example of India, the international community isn't stepping up and telling that you are doing something wrong, you're exacerbating violence. Because those actions of constructing nuclear weapons have been conducted under the jurisdiction of the international community and the International Atomic Energy Agency. No thank you, ma'am. Ladies and gentlemen, secondly, what we say is that there's a willingness to grant and condone weapons under circumstances in which it is necessary. We would like to cite the example of India. The United States has offered, no thank you, sir. The United States has actively offered to give India nuclear weapons. In fact, it has actively pushed the deal, whereas India has been rather passive. The United States wants us to take a harder stance against North Korea. And creating nuclear weapons for the purposes of creating a balance of power under which there can be deterrence is going to be the solution to that problem. Ladies and gentlemen, yes, ma'am.
Didn't your Prime Minister come up and say that Obama was going to to a policy of no violence, didn't you just contradict yourself on exactly what...
No, we didn't contradict ourselves, ma'am. Thank you for that point. What we do say is that recent developments with the United States government shows that the United States is not willing to take its own individual action against North Korea. But as for the South Korean actions that's going to be taken under North Korea, ladies and gentlemen, because of the fact that the United States government believes that we're taking too liberal of an action against North Korea, they want us to take a hardline stance, and team proposition solution is the answer. And thirdly, we say in instances where there's a clear need for security, the international community is willing to condone acts of construction of nuclear weapons. And I would like to cite the example of Israel. It is the worst kept secret in the world, ladies and gentlemen, that Israel has nuclear weapons. In fact, the United States government gives massive subsidies and weapons to the Israeli army in order to make sure that it has means of self-defense. Even it allows the Israeli government to have and construct nuclear weapons. Under circumstances in which, ladies and gentlemen, this clearly shows that when there's a clear need for self and independent defense, that the international community, in tandem with the United States government, is willing to grant weapons, even nuclear weapons, in order to make sure that that balance of power can be created. Ladies and gentlemen, this debate boils down to a very simple issue. And I'm going to ask you the very same critical question that I've asked you at the beginning of my speech. Is it the weapons in and of themselves that are bad? Or is it the way men use it? You heard from side government how we intend to use our weapons for the purposes of deterring and not destruction, ladies and gentlemen. And under those circumstances, how can we possibly let this motion fall?
Thank you, Deputy Prime Minister, for your speech. I would now like to call upon the Deputy Leader of Opposition, Yang Keun-ho.
As Deputy Leader of the Opposition, I'd like to accomplish a couple of things. First, I'd like to answer the couple questions raised by the proposition, then move on to rebuttal their points to show how their logic is flawed, how their assumptions are completely flawed, and move on to the first and second point brought up by our Leader of Opposition, and then move on to the third point to show what kind of economic repercussion Korea would suffer by violating by building nuclear weapons. So the proposition have asked us, is it the intent or the weapon? And but they haven't shown, but what guarantees that South Korea would not use these nuclear weapons for violence? There's no guarantee that South Korea would not use these weapons. And they have given us examples of supervisions of India, India being supervised by IAEA. But ladies and gentlemen, India and Israel did not sign nuclear non-proliferation treaty. And that is why these nations are developing nuclear weapons. However, South Korea has signed non-nuclear. No, thank you. South Korea has signed and ratified nuclear non-proliferation treaty. And violation of this kind of treaty would actually send a negative message to the international community. And okay, and then moving on to their first point, that there's need to stockpile and build these nuclear weapons. But what South Korea wants to do is not to provoke North Korea, because North Korea has nuclear weapons as well as a big army. What we want is not to provoke, not to create another Korean war, but to maintain status quo and use constructive engagement between North Korea and North Korea and South Korea, so that diplomacy can be reached, so that peace can be reached, and whatnot. And okay, this Deputy Leader of Opposition has asked, why hasn't North Korea attacked South Korea? And they have said, but there are some, and then they said North Korea hadn't attacked, but their assumption is based on the fact that North Korea is rational. However, we know from the history, we know from the past experiences that North Korea does not always take rational national stances and actions, but sometimes they could be irrational. They could take, and we believe that building these nuclear weapons to deter North Korea's attack would simply escalate the tensions and it simply exacerbate this deteriorating relations between the two countries. No, thank you. And The second point about mutually assured destruction, and in the history that has happened in the Cold War, the arms race has happened, and what was produced by the Cold War? What was produced? What was product of the arms race? The relation between the United States and Russia, as well as the ideology of communism and democracy, were strained. The Cold War and these mutually MAD did not did not bring any benefits, but simply created problems that we still have to address in the present. So now, I'd like to move on to the case made by the proposition. So so we believe that by violating the nuclear non-proliferation treaty that the South Korea has ratified, we believe that such would bring great detriment to both political and economic South Korea. So our first speaker has shown you the unique relation between North and South Korea. And by South Korea developing nuclear weapons, it will show that South Korea is hypocritical, because all this time South Korea was like, stop developing nuclear weapons, stop developing nuclear weapons, North Korea. But now South Korea came and we're developing nuclear weapons, and it was just seen as hypocritical. And India signed the non-nuclear non-proliferation treaty, and that's why they're allowed to build these nuclear weapons, but South Korea did not. Yes.
Wouldn't that actually send out the message that the South Korean government will not condone acts that are not acceptable in international standards, and actually will take a hardline stance against them if they fail to conform to international standards?
So the international standard that the proposition has brought up is nuclear non-proliferation treaty, and by breaking this international standard, by just breaking treaty that was designed by almost all nations, designed by a lot of nations except for Israel, Pakistan, India, and other nations, and Iran. We believe that such kind of breaking, violation of this kind of international standard, this treaty, would only exacerbate the situation. So now let's move on to our second point, that this would create
Points of information.
No, thank you. This would violate, South Korea building nuclear weapons would send a wrong message to the international community. And South Korea has the Secretary General of the United Nations, Pan Ki-moon, a South Korean. And obviously, this NPT, which was signed by the, which was created by the United Nations, by Secretary General going against this kind of treaty, would show that South Korea is hypocritical and would only exacerbate the situation. And also, it would send South Korea building nuclear weapons just to deter violence would actually create a bad international precedent, because what we're sending is that only way to deter violence and war is increasing military and gathering weapons. And ladies and gentlemen, how is this any different from the Cold War, the arms race that has happened in the past? No, thank you. And we believe that this kind of excuse, just because we don't want North Korea to attack, that's why we're building nuclear weapons. That will send a wrong political message that that only way to deter violence is to build more nuclear weapons. And our third point, which is that there are economic costs associated with violating the nuclear non-proliferation treaty. Ladies and gentlemen, South Korea is on the verge of economic recession, and we simply cannot put our resources and money into this kind of weapons. So no, thank you. So building a nuclear weapon is a clear waste of resources and funds. So, ladies and gentlemen, South Korea does not have South Korea does not have uranium as one of its natural resources, and therefore it must import uranium from foreign nations. And, ladies and gentlemen, these importation is very expensive, and that would actually take away a lot of funding that's going into economic development, would actually channel into this nuclear weapons. And is it even practical? So the nations that have not signed non-nuclear NPT are Israel, India, Pakistan, and these nations. And none of these nations are bordering Korea. And we believe that transportation of uranium through these borders are not only expensive, but very practical, because a lot of NPT ratified countries are surrounding Korea. And let's focus on the NPT. What would happen if South Korea violates this treaty of NPT? So violating would establish South Korea as a low, unstable nation. So Korea would thereby send a strong message to the international community. And the international community would also respond, and their response would be in the form of withdrawal of fundings and investments. So these foreign investors would take out their funds because they will see South Korea as unstable, and South Korea will lose their trust and economic security that we have built so hard. So, and also, international community simply does not want to be seen as a supporter of NPT violator. So this would only exacerbate the situation. And United Nations can sanction embargoes in North Korea, and such has happened in Iraq and Pakistan, which suffer greatly from these embargoes. And just a mere idea of sanction, just a mere idea can actually detract a lot of foreign investment that's coming into Korea. And we believe that violating NPT can also have economic repercussions. So for these reasons, because South Korea would send a wrong message to international relations, exacerbate the situation between North Korea, and also suffer from economic repercussion. For these reasons, we strongly oppose this motion. Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy Leader of Opposition, for your speech. I would now like to call upon the government whip to continue the debate.
I hate to be very pessimistic, but in today's debate, I have no choice but to feel sorry for the opposition, who has always been saying, this will happen, and this will happen, and this will happen, so we're all going to go to hell. That is not the case brought up by the proposition. We wanted Team Opposition to prove to us with examples, with evidence, with even statistics that prove that when South Korea makes nuclear weapons, North Korea is going to attack us, or they're going to be provoked, and the international order is going to be harmed. Did they have proof for these arguments? We say as proposition, they didn't. Now before I move on to my clashes or any rebuttals, I would like to rebut, first of all, the second speaker from the opposition. He first of all came up and said, and he clarified his own stance. He said that we're not going to provoke North Korea. All we're going to do is to maintain the status quo. First of all, maintaining the status quo doesn't solve the problem. As we said in mentioning the context of today's debate, North Korea recently cut phone lines that was there for 58 years just because South Korea co-submitted a resolution in the United Nations that condemns North Korean behavior in human rights. No, thank you, ma'am. These situations are very intimate. They are here right now in November 2008. Their evidence about how things are getting better does not stand, and they did not prove to us how to maintain the status quo will actually solve this problem. And secondly, to this argument is not mutually exclusive to the government's plan. We can have nuclear weapons and also talk to North Korean government. That is the basic plan of the government. We're not saying that we're going to have these weapons and attack them. Basically, all we're saying is that when we have these weapons, we at least have a saying ground. We at least have something to say in terms of asking from them what we need and giving them what they want. No, thank you, ma'am. They also mentioned about how things are going to get worse. But however, as we said many times before, no proof at all. How is this going to happen? Is there a link between our weapons? No, thank you, sir. Between our weapons and destruction of the international order and destruction of the Korean peninsula in terms of diplomacy and also possibly physically. He also mentioned the idea about the hypocritical Korea. Korea has been keep on saying that we should not build, and we're suddenly building them. This is bad. But the fact of the matter is, the very reason why we should build nuclear weapons is that after all of our claims, North Korea managed to make nuclear weapons, and we need to take action. As we said in our two arguments, this is not an action of destruction. It's an action of no thank you, sir, and no thank you, ma'am. This is an action of self-defense and a way to level our grounds in terms of maintaining diplomacy within the region. He also mentioned the fact that this is not really different from the Cold War. This is a very extreme leap. The Cold War was exacerbated by the communist and the capitalist regions, and it was a world-scale Cold War. But the fact of the matter is, this is a very exceptional case where South and North Korea are locked in a deadlock situation, and the United States is not even there to help as much. We believe this is the situation, and this is very different from the Cold War, and we can't understand why the opposition brought that up. He also mentioned, no, thank you, ma'am. Sorry. The idea of the economic recession. The fact of the matter is they do not understand simple principles. If North Korea can make these weapons, why can't South Korea? The fact of the matter is they also mentioned all these transportation costs from other countries. The fact of the matter is, no thank you, ma'am. We have planes, we have international waters. All these can be solved with also the help of the IAEA, no thank you, sir, with the United Nations. As we outlined in our policy, we're not doing this on this own. We're having international consent, we're getting their funds, we're getting the technology. How can they possibly suggest that our policy is impractical? Now I'd like to talk about the two basic issues that I found in today's debate.
Before I proceed, sir.
Yes, ma'am.
On economic recession, just because I can stay awake for 72 hours without sleep doesn't mean I want to. Just because South Korea can doesn't mean it should. What do you say to that, sir?
Though the fact of the matter is, I rebutted to this point because I wanted to prove, because they've been saying that we can't do it. I'm just saying that we can do it. No, thank you, sir. And in tandem with our arguments, we can do it and we should do it, so why not do it? That's our basic stance. Why do they have a problem with our stance? Now I'd like to talk about the status quo before I go on to the clashes. As I mentioned many times before, for the first time in 58 years, something has happened in South Korea only a week ago. It was all over the news. North Korea is really mad at South Korea because we co-signed a resolution that condemns North Korea. This is a very imminent situation. North Korea stopped all funding to the Kaesong industrial complex, and this is a situation that is becoming even more dire in the current situation. And, no thank you, sir. No thank you, ma'am, sorry. And, compounded with that, as our first speaker mentioned, United States is saying, the Barack Obama administration is basically saying we're not going to have violence in that region. Basically, they are going to pull out eventually. And if that happens, what does South Korea have? We're lacking 40,000 military personnel compared to North Korea. We're lacking 9 nuclear warheads. How can we have possibly, no thank you ma'am, the same ground as this country that it will eventually ask a lot from South Korea? We need to take precautions. And as we said many times before, we're not trying to destroy North Korea. That's suicide on both parts. We believe as rational people that we should take such actions. Now let's look at the issue, no thank you ma'am. I would like to define the 3 clashes I found in today's motion, the major points of contention that we found. The first one was about the status quo. The second was about exacerbating situations in the Korean Peninsula. And the third about the international community and how international order will be compromised. The first one about the status quo. Let's look at this from a very rational perspective. If I'm a North Korean official, if I'm Kim Jong-il, no thank you sir, and South Korea suddenly started making nuclear weapons, okay, I might be very mad, I might be very scared, but would I attack South Korea? Would I feel that there's a need to attack South Korea when they, in fact, are being funded by all governments around the world, where they have the support, no thank you ma'am, of the international order? From rationality, we can believe that these weapons do not have a high chance. In fact, they have a very small chance of being used for destruction. We believe, no thank you ma'am, weapons have been used as tools, political tools. We're not saying that this is good, but necessarily in South Korea, in our very situation, this is extremely necessary because of the fact that these precautions, these mentalities are in place. South Korea can't possibly think of attacking North Korea because Seoul can be grounded in 4 minutes. That is the reality. We believe in practical reality, as politicians or as any military personnel, that when we attack, this is going to cause even more problems. How can we possibly suggest that, considering the status quo, we're going to only exacerbate relations? It might exacerbate in the short run, but in the long run, considering that we have similar weapons, we have similar voice in negotiating with each other, we believe this is actually a very efficient case of solving the problem.
Thanks, sir.
No, thank you, ma'am. The second clash, the second point of contention was about the exacerbating situations in South Korea. And as we said many times before, there has been a critical assumption on the part of the opposition. They have mentioned constantly, as I said many times, this will happen, oh my god, this is going to happen, oh my god, we're all going to die. This is not the case. No, thank you, ma'am. The fact of the matter is, as I said, attacking is the last thing we'll ever do. And we believe mutual agreements and mutual diplomacies can happen only when there is a level ground in terms of military capacity. And that is the case in South Korea. It might not be the case in many other situations like Haiti or Colombia because they're all on the same playing grounds. But because North Korea is very unpredictable, as they've said, and because they have all these weapons when the United States of America is pulling out, we believe we need to take some precautionary measures in order to secure our diplomatic means. The second clash, international community. They have mentioned how we are going to set a precedent and many countries will follow and this will become a massive arms race. However, I say many times that this is a very exceptional case. South Korea, we're the only country in the world that are divided for over 50 years. United States president is going to decrease, US warheads are going to go out of our country, US control is eventually going to decrease, and we hopefully might have some diplomacy. But the fact of the matter is, we need to be prepared. As we said many times, we want to deter people from attacking each other, not to destroy the North Korean regime. What was the question we asked many times in today's debate? The question we asked was, what are these weapons for? Are they for deterrence or are they for destroyal? And they have came up here and said that they are for destroyal because it's so bad it's going to cause all these problems under logical beliefs that weren't substantiated by evidence. And we believe as a proposition that we had the higher ground in proving to you how there is no incentive for these countries to attack each other, and we need to take these measures in order to better the security in the Korean Peninsula. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Government Whip, for your speech. I would now like to call upon the Opposition Whip, Janice Yoon, to continue with the debate.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, honorable adjudicators. Now, as the opposition whip, I will achieve a couple things. The first thing I will do is evaluate the context of this debate for you and show you how the opposition has taken a more realistic side in this debate. The second thing I will do is go through the three main clashes of today's debate as are follows. The first is on whether or not there really is a dire need for South Korea's building of nuclear weapons. The second clash will be on whether or not the policy that the proposition advocates aligns with South Korea's national interests. And third, on whether or not this policy actually achieves international aims. We will show you that on all three accounts that the opposition wins. Now, ladies and gentlemen, let's dive into the context. The proposition has first come up to us and said that weapons are meant to deter, not destroy. But ladies and gentlemen, that's what they all say, including those nations that have tested and utilized these weapons of mass destruction. Their credibility under this stated stance false. Ladies and gentlemen, they also said that weapons in themselves are not harmful. The usage is. No, thank you, sirs. But ladies and gentlemen, what we see is that simply creating the perception of potential mass destruction is enough. We may not literally blow up anything. We may not literally blow North Korea up into pieces, but really, it will escalate tensions after we have proven in our points. And this will send a solid, extremely negative statement to the international society at large. Now, what we see is that for the opposition's context, the proposition has said that we are based entirely on assumptions and that all that we have brought is what-ifs. Well, ladies and gentlemen, this pertains entirely to their side as well. They only talk of the potential benefits of building nuclear weapons. How we might be able to better the relationship, tie loose ends, recover from this deteriorating relationship. They have not provided us with any tangible reasons as to why we should take on this excessive burden for the South Korean government. No, thank you, sir. Now, let's go into the clashes. First of all, on whether or not there is a exact need for South Korea to build nuclear weapons in the first place. Now, the proposition justifies this point by saying that, yes, there is a deteriorating relationship with North Korea, and so there is a need for self-defense. But the opposition realizes that this sort of deteriorating relationship is exactly why we stand on side opposition. It furthers our side, because, ladies and gentlemen, at the status quo, the relationship between North and South Korea, no thank you, sir, is hanging on a thread. So why should the South Korean government cut this thread? What reasons are there for this to happen? We would like to ask the proposition to prove to us that building nuclear weapons is going to better regional tensions. Actually, we see that in this showcase of offensive defense that North Korea will act, and contrary to what the proposition believes, it will probably act irrationally. Now, the proposition has said that North Korea is geared towards self-preservation. Exactly, ladies and gentlemen. This is what we agree on. When South Korea builds nuclear weapons, what's going to happen? North Korea is going to act in accordance to its own national interests. Screw the international community. What North Korea wants is self-preservation, and that's exactly what it's going to work towards when South Korea builds nuclear weapons. Yes, sir.
If North Korea decides to take the option of violence without the weapons of mass destruction in South Korea, then what deterrence would you use in order to deter that violence?
Ladies and gentlemen, we would like to ask the proposition to prove to us that there is a motivation, an incentive in the first place for North Korea to attack us first. At the status quo, we see that there are multiple ways in which the international community at large is making sure that this does not happen. And we see that actually North Korea has no interest in doing so, because once it does, what allies are there for North Korea? We see that in the end, even though, no thank you sir, I'm still answering your POI. We see that actually, because North Korea is not interested in waging war, that South Korea does not need to build up self-defense. We believe that because of this, there's no need. Now, we see that actually, we, as the opposition, propose constructive engagement. And the proposition says that it is entirely feasible to talk while both sides are armed with nuclear weapons. They have said that we are going to open up the opportunity to negotiate by leveling the playing field of diplomacy. But ladies and gentlemen, where is the logic in this claim? If both sides are armed, we are going to escalate tensions. What are North and South Korea going to talk about? On how many missiles both sides have? On when one side is going to strike first? What sort of negotiation is going to take place once both sides are armed? South Korea has to step it up, no thank you sir, and remain responsible. Now, our second clash, now that we've established that there is absolutely no necessity in the status quo to build nuclear weapons, we are going to go into the second clash on even if the proposition has really proven to us that there is a need, on whether or not this policy aligns with South Korea's national interests. Now, ladies and gentlemen, if we build nuclear weapons, the only thing will blow up, figuratively speaking, is South Korea. Because what we see that is going to happen is that there are no benefits whatsoever entailed within the proposition's policy. Now, what we see is that if there is a chance at least, that North Korea is going to act in retaliation once South Korea builds nuclear weapons, no thank you sir. Even if there's a slight chance that we cannot do this, because what's going to happen is, as I have said, North Korea is going to act in accord to self-preservation, and all hell will break loose. Now, we also see that in terms of the economy, South Korea is on the verge of economic recession because of the global economic crisis. It has hit home hard. Ladies and gentlemen, we cannot import uranium because it is expensive and impractical. Their plan, no thank you sir, does not contain any practicality whatsoever. And to further this, South Korea cannot afford to send this sort of social statement because it is going to receive an absolute international response. Now, we cannot be economically self-dependent right now. We do not have the sufficient resources to do this. Once the international community acts on South Korea's social statement by imposing sanctions, as was done in Iraq, in Iran, once the international community acts on this, then, ladies and gentlemen, we won't be able to survive. No, thank you, sir. Now, what we see is that this sort of policy does not align at all with South Korea's national interests. Not only is there no need, but South Korea is not going to have any benefits from this policy, as the proposition believes. They have said that we are going to build up our self-defense, beef it up. But really, all that this sort of beefing up is going to do is just lead to there being a further risk, a further potential of there being an escalation of tensions that could break out into warfare. Now, we see that actually, in terms of the evidence that they have given us, well, first of all, we see that they have justified their decision through the example of India and Israel. They have justified that there is a need. No, thank you, sir. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we see that first of all, India, there are no threats to its national security. And also, for India. And for Israel, Israel is surrounded by extremely hostile countries. And we do not condone that either. They have assumed that all this justifies their points, but they do not. Now, going into our third point on whether or not this policy really achieves international aims. Now, we all know that the majority of the world is for world peace. We don't want another Cold War. We don't want another war that can involve more countries than simply South and North Korea, which will happen if we allow for the proposition to win this debate. Now, ladies and gentlemen, the majority of the international community is not for building nuclear weapons. And because of this, because it believes in this, and because South Korea would be then acting against the will of the majority of the international community, we believe that actually it will pay for it. We believe that in the form of sanctions, as was already proposed, by nations cutting off their foreign investment, by withdrawing from South Korea, that we will see the detrimental effects, not only in a social statement, in a social response to what South Korea does, but through the suffering of our economy. Now, ladies and gentlemen, what this debate all really boils down to today is whether or not there was a need, no. Whether or not there were any benefits, or whether or not there was any practicality within the proposition's plan. Ladies and gentlemen, there have been none, and for these reasons, the opposition is extremely proud to oppose. Thank you.
I thank the opposition whip, and I'd like to call upon the opposition replies. Deputy Char, to the opposition.
Ladies and gentlemen, to wrap up the debate for the opposition, I would like to say a few things on exactly what the nature of this policy is going to do. As I've been showing throughout this debate, that is going to increase the risk of possible war, or at the very least, escalate tension with North Korea. What the proposition basically came up here today and told you was that South and North Korea are not best friends. We all know that, ladies and gentlemen. Well, what they have failed to prove is that by enacting this policy of theirs, by having nuclear policies, that they will become more friendly. They have never proved this in any case whatsoever. Whereas we have pointed out to you the huge risks and potential for the relations between South and North Korea to become even worse if we did enact this policy. Now, moving on to a few main things. First of all, South Korea needs to be able to maintain its moral high ground and need to maintain its international image. If we break the non-proliferation treaty, which the proposition had no response to, we're going to seem like a hypocrite, a rogue state. South Korea is going to violate all the trust that the international community has put into South Korea at this point in time. The reason why India and Israel have been able to carry out their nuclear activities is because they didn't sign the NPT. We see that this fact has been overlooked by the proposition in recognizing why some countries have nuclear weapons and why some don't. Furthermore, we pointed out that South Korea would be acting very hypocritically. But again, all they stated was that, there's a need for us to act hypocritically, but never discussed the ramifications of what this policy would have. The proposition is trying to enact this policy, saying that it's going to be good for South Korea, but never described or realized exactly what all the ramifications of their policy are going to have on diplomatic levels. Now moving on, they also never proved to us why North Korea would attack now. Let's look at the history between North and South Korea. In 2002, North Korea was called the Axis of Evil. Yet it did not bomb the United States of America. 2006, it conducted a missile test into the East Sea. In 2008, this year, yes, there was a tourist murder. Yes, there was all this tension. Yes, they destructed and then they reconstructed the nuclear reactor. However, all this action does not prove that we have to make nuclear policies now. It does not prove that we need nuclear weapons now. What it proves is that we have to return back to the drawing board without provoking North Korea in order to maintain the status quo and make sure that North Korea does not become provoked to actually attack another state. We have to see that the worst provocation that could happen in the international community, besides calling North Korea insults such as the axis of evil, is the proposition's policy. Thank you for encouraging for such a policy, which is actually going to make the international community more isolated from North Korea, and North Korea is actually going to become more suspicious, more isolated, and is not going to be able to actually maintain its integrity and going to come back to international community. We have to also recognize, ladies and gentlemen, what exactly is at risk here. What is at risk here? Millions of South Korean lives, millions of North Korean lives, possibly even dragging in the international community into this, because both South Korea and North Korea have allies which are P5 nations. We have to recognize that the proposition's radical action is going to pose many civilians' lives at risk, whereas we on the opposition are pointing out that without this policy, we can pursue other policies in which to maintain the status quo so that all of the people in this assembly don't have to live in the fear of being attacked by North Korea day to day because of some policy by the South Korean government that it thinks is going to restore the balance of power. We on the opposition cannot condone this. It's a show act. We don't think it's actually going to change anything with North Korea except to make it even worse and to make it believe that South Korea is even more of a hypocrite than it already thinks that South Korea to some degree is. For these reasons, because we cannot put the millions of civilians of lives at risk, because they never answered to us on exactly the differences in international community and the international status of South Korea, we believe that we must oppose. Thank you. For 3 minutes and 45 seconds.
Thank you. I'd now like to call upon the government reply.
Okay. There were 3 clashes in today's debate, ladies and gentlemen. The first one was there an imminent need for nuclear weapons? The second was there really a possibility of a cataclysm depicted by the opposition side actually happening? And perhaps the final clash, the most important clash was is there a mechanism better than the one proposed by the proposition side of today to improve relations between the South and the North? Let's look at if there is an imminent need for nuclear weapons. The status quo, as we have proved to you through numerous examples, is rapidly deteriorating, and the current political status in the United States is such that we cannot count on their aid 100%. So it is the duty of every responsible government, ladies and gentlemen, to provide for the protection of its people. The opposition side gave us no alternative plan. They consented to the point that the current status quo is indeed deteriorating, and yet they said, oh, maybe we should just sit down in a corner and wish for the best. Ladies and gentlemen, a responsible government does what is best for its people, and in this instance, providing for a national defense system and a mechanism of diplomacy which can be opened should be the primary concern for any nation, and that does not exclude South Korea. Let's look at the possibility of the cataclysm that the opposition side has depicted for your benefit. They said that the integrity of the Republic of Korean government would be desecrated. They said that, however, ladies and gentlemen, there has been no act of aggression on any part from the Republic of Korea in its past history. Not to mention that there was no attack by any nuclear power over the past years when nuclear weapons have been proliferated, with the exception of the United States. Ladies and gentlemen, the possibility of a cataclysm for North Korea, for South Korea, for the entire world is actually overblown on the side of the opposition side today. They also said how Korea would lose its international standing as its images fall and trades would go down. However, ladies and gentlemen, we've stated clearly in our policy line that we would conduct these policies in tandem with international organizations such as the International Atomic Energy Agency. So we do not understand where the international condemnation comes into play here, because we obviously would do it under the supervision of international organizations. Now, perhaps the most final part about improving relations. Any end to the policy regarding North Korea given by the part of the proposition side in any government of South Korea is to improve relations with South Korea, and we believe this as well. With the deterioration of relations in the status quo, there needs to be proactive action taken by the proposition side of today's debate. Right now, militarily, the two nations are not equal. We've explained all this to you. Seoul can be leveled in 4 minutes. They have 9 nuclear warheads, we have none. They have immense artillery weapons and troops, which they can mobilize into Seoul within 4 hours. Ladies and gentlemen, militarily, we are unequal, and there needs to be a balance of power for any profound talks to take place. Let's just take a simple analogy. A big guy, a really big guy, he has a black belt in Taekwondo, and he meets this really, really small guy who's squeaky. And they get into a fight, or perhaps they're getting ready to get into a fight. Do you think the big guy will take the little guy seriously if perhaps he wasn't armed with an aluminum baseball bat, ladies and gentlemen? Just think common sense here. We believe that the inherent goal of any diplomatic arena is to provide a fair and equal playing field in which we can conduct profound conversation with the opposing party, and that will, in the end, in the long run, provide for the security and peace of the East Asian region as a whole. And also the point about provoking DPRK, well, there is a historical precedent. We imported huge amounts of F-15K airplanes from the United States of America when they were first out for sale. And even with the implementation of these high-tech weaponry, we were not attacked by DPRK, and therefore we believe that our political objectives will be better gained without exacerbating the situation. The opposition side went, well. And I tried to keep count of the number of wills that the opposition side presented to you before this house today, and I lost count at around 276. However, ladies and gentlemen, what the proposition side will do for you in the long run is provide a safer world for our citizens. Thank you.